everybody, it's me, Big Ugly Jim. So we're going to start by talking about the term Anglo Saxon. This is from the Smithsonian Magazine. Many people may be aware of the Smithsonian as a thing that does smart people stuff. They have museums, they have magazines, and it's they're part of the sort of the scholarly world. So this article is called "The Many Myths of the Term Anglo-Saxon." And it's basically Mary Rambaran Olm and Eric Wade talking about the phrase and stuff. So here's a picture. That's a good picture. I don't know what it's a picture of. Apparently, it's a scene from the Bayeux Tapestry, which famously depicts William the Conqueror's victory over the so-called Anglo-Saxons. So, let's read. People in the United States and Great Britain have long drawn on imagined Anglo-Saxon heritage as an exemplar of European whiteness. It's important when you're talking about things like that you have to pronounce the H in white. You can't just say whiteness, you have to go whiteness. It's a thing. Before becoming president, Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders, because I'm a Rough Rider filled up with Christ's love. Give me that Christian side hug. That Christian side. Oh, sorry. Led his Rough Riders on the 1898 U.S. invasion of Cuba with a copy of Edmund Demolins's racist manifesto, Anglo-Saxon Superiority in tow. That, I don't think of Teddy Roosevelt as being a white supremacist, but yeah, you can't argue if that's the case. I'm assuming the Smithsonian wasn't just like making shit up there, so we'll go with it. Fuck Teddy Roosevelt. In the 1920s, the Anglo-Saxon clubs of America lobbied in favor of segregation and argued for the exclusions of those with even a drop of any blood other than Caucasian. This is why I found it so funny when Pat King, noted racist and convoy organizer, was there was a clip of him talking about the Great Replacement is all about making sure that the whites, the Anglo-Saxons are destroyed utterly, and this is why, because they're scared of us, because the Anglo-Saxon is the most strong bloodline, which is fucking ridiculous, particularly with the one-drop rule, which was very much a thing. If you're even a drop of non-white, then you're not white enough for me. Then that seems like the weakest bloodline. The one-drop rule, to me, kind of clearly implies that Anglo-Saxon, probably not that strong a bloodline, probably pretty fucking weak if a single drop of something else can ruin it. Fucking wieners. In the same time frame, a Baptist minister from Atlanta declared, "The Ku Klux Klan is not fighting anybody. It is simply a pro-Anglo-Saxon." I think we can look at the historical record and go, maybe that's a bit of a stretch. Maybe they were actually fighting people because they were quote-unquote pro-Anglo-Saxon. Hot take, but the Klan sucks. That's I'm going to go on that limb there. Across the Atlantic in 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill smugly inquired, "Why be apologetic about Anglo-Saxon superiority? That we were superior, that we had the common heritage which had been worked out over the centuries in England and had been perfected by our Constitution." Yeah, Winston Churchill, noted drunk, notable racist, and we remember him gladly because he happened to be the more competent of the people who was around leading Britain during World War II. But he was a big piece of shit. That was his job, was to just be a big piece of shit. Today, the term Anglo-Saxon is little used in mainstream America circles because perhaps as a chiding wasp label directed toward northeastern elites. But as news from earlier this year has shown, it still exists as a supremacist dog whistle. Its association with whiteness has saturated our lexicon to the point that it's often misused in political discourse and weaponized to promote far-right ideology. In April 2021, the U.S. House of Representatives America First caucus. For the record, anytime you see something first, you can just assume that that's a racist organization, right? Britain first, Canada first, and add proud in there too. First and proud, generally speaking, what they are is organizations intended to push a very racist agenda while having the plausible deniability of being like, oh no, we're not White power, well, white pride. Why should other people be allowed to be pride, but we don't have the pride? That's all the bullshit that they do. So yeah, the America First Caucus published a 7-page policy platform claiming that the country's borders and culture are strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions. Which, if you think about, like, what were the political traditions of the Anglo-Saxons? Well, they were around like 1,000 years ago, so I'm assuming serfdom. Those proud political traditions of being ruled by a king actually makes sense in light of the whole Trump thing. But okay, I'm digressing. On social media, jokes about a return to trial by combat, sword fights, thatched roofs, and other seemingly Anglo-Saxon practices quickly gained traction. Waka waka. How did this obscure term, little used in the Middle Ages themselves, become a modern phrase meaning both a medieval period in early England and a euphemism for whiteness? Who were the actual people now known as the Anglo-Saxons, and what terminology should be used instead of the ahistorical title? The Anglo-Saxon myth perpetuates a false idea of what it means to be native to Britain. You see guys like Sargon of Akkad who will refer to himself as an indigenous person because he's Anglo-Saxon living in Britain or the United Kingdom or wherever the fuck he lives. I think he lives in Britain, but whatever. I don't fucking care. It's stupid. It's the same as when white people in Canada are like, well, I'm indigenous because I was born here. Well, that's not what the word means, fuck ass. Though the hyphenated term is sometimes used as a catch-all phrase to describe the dominant tribes of early England, it is historically inaccurate and wasn't actually used much prior to the Norman conquest of 1066. The name didn't even originate in England. Instead, it first appeared on the continent, where Latin writers used it to distinguish between the Germanic Saxons of mainland Europe and the English Saxons. The few uses of Anglo-Saxon in Old English seem to be borrowed from the Latin Angli Saxones. Manuscript evidence from pre-conquest England reveals that kings used the Latin term almost exclusively in Latin charters, legal documents, and for a brief period in their titles, such as Anglorum Saxonum Rex, or King of the Anglo-Saxons. The references describe kings like Alfred and Edward who did not rule nor claim to rule all the English kingdoms. They were specifically referring to the English Saxons from the continental Saxons. Scholars have no evidence of anyone before 1066 referring to themselves as an Anglo-Saxon in the singular or describing their politics or traditions as Anglo-Saxon. While one might be king of the Anglo-Saxon or of the English Saxons, nobody seems to have claimed to be an English Saxon, in other words. Who then were the groups that lend Anglo-Saxon its name? The Angles were one of the main Germanic peoples from modern-day southern Denmark and northern Germany to settle in Great Britain. The first known mention of the Angli was recorded by the 1st century Roman historian Tacitus. Just as the Angles settled in Britain, so too did the Saxons, along with the Frisians, Jutes, it's probably German, so it's probably like Jutes, and other lesser-known peoples. Originally from what is now Germany, these Saxons became one of the dominant groups in Britain, though the standalone word Sax in Old English was not widely used and only for the Saxon groups, never for all these people together. Together, they were most commonly called Englisk. I'm sure I'm ruining that. It's probably like English, but Englisk. We're going to use Englisk. For years, scholars of medieval history have explained that the term Anglo-Saxon has a long history of misuse, is inaccurate, and is generally used in a racist context. The Gasps, based on surviving texts, early inhabitants of the region were more commonly called themselves English or Anglican. Over the span of the early English period from 410 AD, when various tribes settled on the British Islands after the Romans left, to shortly after 1066, the term only appears 3 times in the entire corpus of Old English literature. All of these instances are in the 10th century. Modern references to Anglo-Saxon political traditions would benefit from readings of actual Old English charters. Early medieval documents predominantly preoccupied with land grants, writs, and wills. From the 8th century onward, these charters increasingly favored granting land to lay people, many of whom were migrants. Those Americans who seek a return to the roots of Anglo-Saxons should realize that this actually translates to more open, inclusive borders. As historian Sharif Abdelkarim writes, first millennium Britain offers one glimpse into the extent to which communities mixed and flourished. Archaeological finds and historiographical sources, he adds, suggest extensive exchange and assimilation among Britain's inhabitants and settlers. That sounds like we might get some of them one little droppies in there. Oh, shit. One early medieval English king, Offa, minted a commemorative coin modeled on the Abbasid dinar, complete with a copy of the Islamic Declaration of Faith. Another king, the famed Alfred the Great, wrote in his law code that you must not oppress foreigners and strangers because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows that people of sub-Saharan African descent lived in the early England, according to scholar Paul Edward Montgomery Ramirez. Following centuries of disuse after the Norman conquest, the term Anglo Saxon reappeared in the late 16th century in antiquarian literature to refer to pre-conquest peoples in England. Notably, as philologist David Wilton explains, the term was revived in the same period that the classification of the Middle Ages emerged. Essentially, he writes, the revival of the term Anglo-Saxon appears during a period of looking to the past to revive a national patrimony. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, English historians were using the term as an ethno-racial identifier. The British historian Jacob Abbott, for instance, included an entire chapter on race theory in his 1860 book on 9th century King Alfred, describing how history showed the white race's superiority and that the medieval Alfred demonstrated that amongst the white people, the modern Anglo-Saxon race was most destined for greatness, even though one fucking drop ruins it. During the era of British and later American imperialism and colonization, this racially charged meaning became the most prominent use of the term, surpassing any historically grounded references to pre-conquest England. Both American and English writers have rebranded Anglo-Saxon to include false narratives around white racial superiority. President Thomas Jefferson perpetuated the Anglo-Saxon myth as a kind of racial prophecy of white conquest, envisioning early settlers as the continuation of their European forebears. The entire settler colonial narrative has always centered on white people migrating to the Americas, just as the German tribes migrated to the British Isles. Their immigration appears natural and necessary within the larger narrative of Europe standing at the apex of civilization. Anglo-Saxon subsumes all other tribes and peoples in an oversimplified way. It says nothing of Britons and others who migrated or settled in the region. This is not a heritage story grounded in facts. Indeed, the myth often suspiciously erases the fact that the Anglo and Saxon peoples were migrants. The field of medieval studies has increasingly begun to discard the use of Anglo-Saxon in favor of more accurate, less racist terminology. More specific terms such as Saxon, Angles, or Northumbrians allow for greater accuracy. More broadly, terms like early medieval English and insular Saxons are used in lieu of Anglo-Saxon. Their own manuscripts, meanwhile, most often use English to describe themselves, as the response to the AFC statement suggests. The phrase is becoming increasingly unacceptable to the public. For many, however, it continues to evoke an imagined medieval past that justifies belief in white Western superiority. Historically speaking, the name Anglo-Saxon has more connection to white hoods than boar-decorated helmets. The record shows that myths about the past can be exploited to create hateful policies, but as perceptive readers, we can arm ourselves against hate by wielding historical precision as a weapon. So that's sort of the more historical view of the term Anglo-Saxon. And this is a term that I find funny as all sin, because people will refer to it like, the great Anglo-Saxon political traditions. Well, what the fuck were those traditions? What was going on in the world 1,000 years ago? Did we have thriving democracies where the young white people had the ability to own, their own land and work? I'm pretty sure it was serfdom. Pretty sure all them kings that were the kings of the time, they weren't nice. First off, I want to say thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It really does help me out. Thank you to my patrons that support me on Patreon. I am a little streamer, and these people are all really awesome for supporting me. I try to put up stuff at least once a week, and I live stream every Saturday at noon Mountain Time on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, like an old man. Again, thanks for watching, and have a kick-ass day.